Good morning and welcome back now to the reading of God's Word. This week we're going to be in four really fantastic books, and that is the book of Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter. These are great reading books and want to ask you to pay a particular attention as you read through these books. These are very powerful letters that have been written. We get into the first of the book of Hebrews. The book of Romans is said to be the evangelistic book written by Paul. And to me, Hebrews is its companion. Hebrews explains Christ. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But then James, as we get to James, we're going to be talking about your life. And James gets into your life. He sort of steps on your toes, tells you how you should be living if you are truly saved by Christ and how you want to lead a Christly life. And then we get into Peter, his first letter of exhortation and hope because of the persecution that is coming on all of Christians. And then his final letter, a letter of farewell, as he knows, as Paul did in his second letter to Timothy, that he was about to be martyred. And this would have been under the Roman leader Nero, who was really persecuting many Christians at that time. But we go back now and let's get started into the book of Hebrews. This is a fantastic book. This is my favorite book of all of the New Testament because it is so powerful in it. It explains Christ, really. And the whole book is about the supremacy of Christ. And after a great opening, which has many sermons in it by itself, just in the first four verses, then he goes into explanation of four different comparisons of Christ. The first comparison is to the angels, and really and truly it is the comparison that the supremacy of Christ is not only over angels but over all of creation. And we get that in chapter 1. We move to chapters 2 through 4, and what we get is a discussion of his supremacy over Moses. And as we get to that, we will see then that Moses was a servant in his house. Jesus is the master of his house, Lord over his house. We'll get into that discussion when we get there. Third point and the fourth point really they're so close together. One is the priesthood of Christ, his priesthood exalted, sitting at the right hand of God. But his priestly line is in the order of Melchizedek and not in the order of Aaron. So his priestly line, which is everlasting through eternity, is not like anything like Aaron's line. Each of those were going to die, and each of those were sinful people. They had to atone for themselves before they could atone for the people. But Jesus did this once and for all. So then we get into, obviously, then the sacrifice of Christ. And the sacrifice of Christ was a one-time sacrifice instead of the annual ones that the line of Aaron were doing. So we get into this discussion. Very powerful, great book to be reading in here. And as we said, and we go back into chapter 1 as we get there, the very first four verses, there are sermons and sermons and sermons in these first four verses. It is because and it begins, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets in many portions in many ways. Well, that takes us back to the kings, the prophets. It takes us back to throughout the whole history of all of that. God has worked with Israel. He's given them the law. He's given them warnings over and over again, and they finally failed long enough that a day came and God brought judgment and the exile happened. And since that time, Israel has never really had a nation until 1948. But that's a different discussion for a different time. And so we see that he spoke so often through all of the prophets. But now he says, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, who he has appointed heir of all things, through whom he made the world. So this is a point here that Christ himself is exalted over all things. Here, the discussion is going to carry on now in chapter 1 that he is exalted above all the angels because he is called the Son of God, but none of the angels ever had any kind of a position like that. So it is a very strong amount of reading right here, and he provides a lot of evidence of Christ's supremacy over all creation. And so that verse, that chapter 1 is very strong. Read that carefully. It's just some really great reading. Now, as we get through these things too, he follows up each of these discussions that we get into with a warning that we are not to slip away. We get into this sort of a direction of apostasy if we're not really careful. But anyway, he's over the angels, he's over Moses, his priesthood and his sacrifice are all supreme as we go through these things. So again, we look at chapter 1, and he is supreme over all creation and over all the angels. Then we get into chapter 2, and in verse 1 chapter 2 is one of the first and one of the strongest warnings. And in it he says, "For this reason we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away from it." Be careful about that. So he is telling us right away that we have the opportunity. We can ignore what we have heard. We can begin to drift away. That is very prevalent right now in our day and time. People are drifting away from the church. They're drifting away from the word. They're drifting away from what they thought they knew and believed. It is a very strong warning that we do not drift away. There's a whole other set of sermons. It's just in that one verse about drifting away and how we are to act. And we would take the action. Actually, you go back to when we get to the book of James, that is the evidence of our faith. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well too. But that's a very powerful warning right there. And we go on to say that now in the first verse, in the first chapter, in the first 4 verses, he said that after speaking through the prophets, and all these speaking through the prophets really came from angels to the prophets for the most part. And now he has spoken to us in Christ. And it goes on to say here that he did not subject to angels the world to come. In other words, this age of grace and this amount of what we have now, he did not, even God alone did not trust sending the angels with this message. He sent his son with the message to give to us directly. This is from the mouth of God himself, from Jesus himself, about what we are to do, how we're to live. And it is tremendously powerful in this chapter 2 that we get that. And through his sacrifice, we know that in verse 14, he says he is rendered powerless, him who had the power of death, and that would be the devil. So we get into a very strong discussion right here. Chapter 3, we get into the supremacy of Christ over Moses. As we look at that, it's another comparison here that as you read through this, first of all, you see that Moses, of course, is the most prominent prophet. He is the prophet above all prophets to the Hebrew nation, to the Israelites. And he was given the law, the Torah, and we've got to pay attention to that because that was what Israel was living by. They had to live by. It's what God gave them to live by. Today, we have half of that Torah has been replaced. That would be the sacrificial system, but not the moral value systems. We have to pay attention as much to that as well. But he was supreme over Moses, as Moses was a servant in his house. But Christ is a master of his house. So when we look at that, we see a lot of difference in what Moses and what his position was, who he was and what his position was over Jesus, who he is and what his position is. Very strong verbiage in these letters right here, in all of these scriptures right here. And it gives us, again, warnings. The peril of, in chapter 3, verses 7 through 19, the peril of unbelief. That's the warning not to turn away. Today, if you hear his voice, do not turn away. Pay attention and act on that. Verse 12, take care not to have an evil, unbelieving heart. Verses 16 through 19, what happened to Israel for their unbelief. He gives you an example there of that. And that whole history of Israel, by the way, is a great warning of what happens. God is a judgmental God. He's a non-partial God, and he will do, if he did it to Israel, he will do it to the rest of us as well. If we fall away, his judgment is already set for those who do not believe. Chapter 4, we get into the consequences, of course, of what happened, and that is again, that is a very powerful discussion that we need to pay attention to in this day and time, because what we see is the same thing that happened with Israel, and they fell away. They were idolatrous people, and they would get caught up in so many worldly things and pagan gods and so forth. What are we seeing in our world today? Be very careful of that. It is very, very strong verbiage that we have in there. Chapter 5, we go through, now we get into chapters 5 through 10, really. This is one really long discussion, and it covers two main points. What it covers is the priesthood of Christ and the sacrifice of Christ. This is very powerful. And what we get into, first of all, is the priesthood. Now, the priesthood of Christ, of course, if we back up and we look at the priest according to the order of Aaron. Okay, so what we have then is Levi, actually one of the sons of Jacob and renamed Israel. So Levi, from there is where the priesthood came from. And then we had the sons of Korah, and from the sons of Korah we had then the line of Aaron. So Aaron is where Moses, of course, told Aaron that's what was going to happen. So all this priestly line that came from Aaron, each and every one of them who was named the high priest each year, and this is where we're going in this as far as the sacrifice was concerned, because it was from Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur was the one major sacrifice of the year to atone for all the sins of the nation. It's where we get the scapegoat. We don't have time to get into Leviticus with that particular sacrifice, but this is what he's talking about. This is the primary sacrifice for the year for them. So I wish we had time to teach this. I really, really do. But the priest was in themselves, they had their own iniquity. They were guilty of sin, so they had to atone for their own sin and then turn around and atone for then the sins of the nation. So it was very strong comparison in here to that. Christ, of course, his priesthood came actually, first of all, his line was from the line of Judah and not from the line of Levi. So that was a different point right there that the Hebrews would find hard to accept. But his was on the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek, you have to go back to Genesis, and you will see that this Melchizedek was the king of Salem, and he was the Prince of Peace, and it was the one that met him on his way home from the slaughter of the kings, to which Abraham had portioned out a tenth of the portion of the choicest spoils. We see it again as David makes reference to that in Psalm 110. So it's there as well. And then we get this discussion yet again about Melchizedek here in this book of Hebrews. Very, very strong there about the priesthood of Christ. And we get the warning again, another warning in chapter 6 as we look at it. And he's saying, by now you ought to be good students of this, but as it is, you still need to be. You're still learning, and that shouldn't be. Once we get started in these things, it should be very powerful to. You should understand by now. It's what he's really saying. And then there is he really zeroes in chapter 7. As far as the priesthood of Christ, that's that long discussion about Melchizedek. So as you read through that, you get there, and then an explanation in chapter 8. He is a minister in a true tabernacle. This tabernacle in heaven is what was given to Moses when Moses had to build the tabernacle when he came down off the Mount Sinai, he was given a copy of this, and this goes back to that original true tabernacle, one not built by God and not by men. Very strong, very strong. We're just looking here in this video here at the first 8 chapters of the book of Hebrews. In the next video, we're going to finish this up, 9 through 13, another very strong discussion. So read this carefully. Pay a lot of attention as you read this book of Hebrews. Very powerful book. And we want to ask God to give you some discernment and understanding as you read it. And please pay attention as you do that. And with that, may God bless the reading of His Word.